This is Read Japanese Literature. My name is Allison Fincher. Read Japanese Literature is a podcast about Japanese fiction and some of its best works. All the works we discuss are available in translation, so you can read along if you want, and you can find out more at readjapaneseliterature.com. I am really excited to bring you this two-parter about LGBTQ stories from Japan, starting with some of the oldest writing in the Japanese language. Thanks for your patience while I did my research and put it all together. We're going to be doing something a little bit different. Normally, when I record an episode, I talk first about history and context, then about the literature. We're not doing that today. Instead, I'm going to tell the story with more of a cultural moment by cultural moment approach, the history and the literature of same-sex sexuality and culture in Japan. Today, part one is going to cover early Japan, medieval Japan, Edo period Japan, and Meiji Japan. So, more or less the beginnings of written Japanese to about 1912. We won't really be able to talk about women who love women and their stories today. That's not because there weren't women who loved women until the 20th century. There just isn't a lot of historical evidence and virtually no written stories about these kinds of relationships. Part 2 will cover most of the 20th and the beginnings of the 21st century, Taisho Japan, Japan during and after the Pacific War, Japan during the economic miracle, in the near past, and even one or two contemporary writers. A caveat before we begin. I do realize that the title LGBTQ Stories from Japan is far from perfect. Lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, and queer are all terms that have a particular meaning in English-speaking countries in 2024, a meaning that has changed dramatically in some instances even within English-speaking countries and even within the last couple of decades. They don't all have the same definitions in Japan, even in 2024. And they definitely didn't mean the same things over the 1,000+ year history we'll be covering. And of course, most of the people we'll discuss today lived and died before the LGBTQ identity even existed in the way it does today, in Japan or elsewhere. I've chosen the title LGBTQ Stories from Japan anyway to make these kinds of stories easier for English-speaking readers to find. But given all this background, I hope you'll understand that while I've done my best to use appropriate terminology to describe the way people acted or felt at a given historical moment, it's pretty hard to do, and I've probably made mistakes. And just to be clear, I'm calling this episode LGBTQ Stories from Japan because all the stories we're discussing today will be about same-sex sexuality or queer love. But not all of the authors we're talking about practiced same-sex sexuality by the standards of their own day or by the standards of ours. And finally, a quick episode warning, this two-parter is rated mature, but it's definitely not because I only think adults can talk about queerness. My family and my kids talk about these topics all the time. It's rated mature because some of these texts are fairly explicit. The pre-modern Japanese in particular are delightfully candid and witty about sex in comparison to the puritanical English-speaking writers to their west. There's a popular tradition that the esoteric Buddhist monk Kukai brought male-male sexuality to Japan during the 800s. Now, of course, we have to take this with a grain of salt. There isn't really much teaching involved in having sex with someone we're attracted to. Surely folks in Japan had been happily enjoying all kinds of sexual encounters for millennia, just like they had been all over the world. Nevertheless, let me tell you the legends associated with the actual historical monk Kukai and Japanese male-male sexuality. Kukai lived from 774 to 835 CE, and he's better known today by his posthumous title Kobodashi. He traveled to China and returned about 806. 806 is during the Heian period of Japanese history, which lasted from 794 to 1185 CE. The trip to China resulted in the importation of esoteric Buddhist teachings to Japan. When Kukai returned to Japan, he moved to Mount Koya and founded the Shingon, or True Word School of Japanese Buddhism. He is also supposed to have brought the Chinese practice of monastic homosexuality with him. Junichi Iwata was one of the great scholars of Japanese male-male relationships and sexuality. For what it's worth, Junichi Iwata considered these stories about Kukai entirely mythological and noted there isn't even any decisive historical evidence that Kukai practiced male-male sexuality himself. So let's talk about the practice of Buddhist monastic homosexuality, or Chigo. Today, almost any culture in the world, including Japan, would consider the practice of Chigo to be pedophilia, or more often, pederasty, and condemn it as such. I do ask you to keep in mind that 1, these traditions weren't unique to Japan or East Asia. They were practiced by some of the most celebrated members of ancient Greek and ancient Roman culture. For example, one of Plato's most famous dialogues includes Socrates talking about his attraction to a young man. 2, that what it means to be a child has changed a lot in the last 1,500 years. And 3, that past homosexual practices in no way justify any prejudice against queer men and women today. Also, I hope it's clear that I'm not celebrating or defending having sex with young people. I'm just relaying facts. The word Chigo means male acolyte. An acolyte is a liturgical assistant, often someone in training to become a priest or minister themselves. Most Chigo were 12 to 19, although some were younger. An older monk, the nenja, lover or admirer, would partner with the Chigo, often as each other's only partner, until the Chigo reached adulthood or left the monastery. For most of Japanese history, male Buddhist clergy took vows to avoid sexual contact with women, and practicing Chigo wasn't seen as a way of skirting their vows. It often wasn't perceived as a violation of their vows at all. There are 14th and 15th century prose stories called Chigo Monogatari, or acolyte tales. They were retold and printed well into the Edo period, which lasted from 1603 to 1868. We'll talk about the Edo period later today. These tales shared a lot with the Setsuwa we discussed in a Season 1 episode, Setsuwa and Medieval Japanese Buddhism. In fact, some of them were more religious than erotic. For example, in some stories, a monk loses his beloved Chigo, and that loss leads him to enlightenment. In others, the youthful Chigo's beauty turns out to be a symbol of Buddhist truth. Sometimes the Chigo is even the incarnation of a bodhisattva. A bodhisattva is a person who refuses to enter nirvana or Buddhist paradise so they can stay behind and help others reach enlightenment too. These Chigo bodhisattvas might transform themselves into beautiful young boys to help a monk reach salvation. On the other hand, some of these stories are reasonably explicit. Scholar Suneo Watanabe refers to them as, quote, true homosexual novels. By the end of the 15th century, some of the largest Buddhist sects in Japan abandoned the requirement that monks take vows to avoid sex with women. Later, the Edo-era government allowed all monks to marry. These changes were part of broader social developments that moved the most prominent practice of male-male sexuality away from the religious world to the military and political one. We'll turn to samurai and the wakashu in just a minute. There is literature from Heian, Japan, from outside of that monastic Chigo tradition that describes male-male sexuality or a kind of queer love. Junichi Iwata was one of the great scholars of Japanese male-male relationships and sexuality. Iwata cataloged a huge number of Japanese texts that involved mentions of male-male sexuality, and to search for the origins of male-male sexuality in Japan brought him all the way back to one of the earliest written texts in Japanese. Not the Kojiki, but the Nihon Shoki, or the Chronicles of Japan. According to the Nihon Shoki, 2 men were guilty of the sin of azunai. The gods abominated the vice of these 2 very intimate friends after one followed the other in death by committing suicide himself. Afterward, the sun never shone on their shared grave. The semi-legendary Empress Jingu visited their shared grave around the year 200 CE and had their bodies moved into separate graves apart from each other. After that, the sun began to shine in the area again. And that is probably the earliest recorded reference to male-male sexuality in Japanese literature. It's not a particularly edifying one, and it's a rare reference that stigmatizes sexuality between men. Gustav Helt, a scholar of the earliest written Japanese, identifies homosocial desire in poetic exchanges between noblemen in the Heian-era anthology, the Kokin Wakashu, which was published in the early 10th century. Murasaki Shikibu's The Tale of Genji was written in the early 11th century. It is widely regarded as one of the greatest works of Japanese literature ever written. When the protagonist, Genji, is 17, he spends the night with Kogimi, the 12 or 13-year-old younger brother of a married woman who spurns him. In Edward Seidensticker's translation, the narrator informs the reader that, quote, the boy was delighted, such were Genji's youthful charms, and, quote, Genji, for his part, or so one is informed, found the boy more attractive than his chilly sister. They continue to spend time together for several chapters while Genji tries to seduce Kogimi's sister. Genji favors him and eventually helps him climb the aristocratic ranks fairly quickly. In the end, Genji breaks off the relationship because of Kogimi's family. The events, quote, plunge the boy into the darkest melancholy. Finally, there are 2 texts from the 12th century that explore gender in fascinating ways. They've been translated into English as The Changelings and Partings at Dawn. The Changelings tells the story of a brother and sister. The brother is raised to live as a woman, and the sister is raised to live as a man. Each passes as the opposite gender in court. Sex and marriage brings the issue to a head, and the 2 eventually switch back to the roles they were born to play. You can read the entire story in translation by Rosette F. Willig. Partings at Dawn is about another girl, Ariaki, raised as a boy. This time, the deception isn't discovered until the emperor himself falls in love with her while still thinking that she's a man. It's only available in excerpts in English in the anthology Partings at Dawn, edited by Stephen D. Miller. The translation is by Robert Omar Khan, but even in excerpts, the story is really charming. The emperor grows to like his young companion, the young companion he thinks is male, even noticing he has, quote, a characteristic scent, and wondering to himself, quote, how he would feel if there were a woman like that at court. He eventually feels, quote, rather confused longings. Ariaki realizes the emperor is a match. The way I feel about him, my heart will never change. The emperor finds out the truth, events proceed, and Ariaki becomes pregnant. The pair conspires to have her introduced to his household as a woman. Throughout, the narrator is remarkably sensitive to how constrained Ariaki will now feel, forced to live as a woman. Even as empress, Ariaki is nostalgic for life as the handsomest man at court and pursues relationships with some of the court's ladies. As the samurai became the dominant political class in Japan, the center of homosexual practice moved from the monastery to the fortress, the world of the monk religious class to the world of the samurai warrior class. The object of desire changed from a chigo to a wakashu, meaning simply young man, usually between 13 and 20. The person who did the desiring was no longer a priest but an older samurai, the ninja paired with the wakashu. Not ninja like the semi-legendary people who run around in black killing people as assassins, but Nenja. The practice became known as wakashu, meaning youth, do, meaning way of, the way of youth, by about 1485. Again, almost any culture in the world, including Japan, would consider the practice of wakashudo pederasty and condemn it as such. And again, I hope it's clear that I'm not celebrating or defending having sex with minors. I'm just relaying facts. The samurai class actively encouraged wakashudo as appropriate for samurai men. A 1653 text called what roughly translates as a dog's idle hours even claims that wakashudo is the foundation for excellence in daily life. Quote, "It is natural for a samurai to make every effort to excel with pen and sword. Beyond that, what is important to us is not ever to forget, even to our last moment, the spirit of wakashudo. If we should forget it, it will not be possible for us to maintain the decencies, nor gentleness of speech, nor the refinement of polite behavior." One of the important differences between the way male-male sexuality was perceived in medieval and early modern Japan, and in the way it was perceived in contemporary Europe, is that it was actually considered more masculine for a man to have intercourse with another man. Sometimes the love of a woman is even supposed to feminize a man. The idea that sex with men is more manly than sex with women is an important undercurrent in Japanese gay culture, at least through the life of Yukio Mishima, and we'll be coming back to it in Part 1 and Part 2. Wakashudo was a kind of military homosexual practice very similar to the cultural norms in ancient Sparta. It was considered part of the education of a young samurai, useful for understanding virtue, honesty, and beauty. And one of the most important virtues of wakashudo encouraged in the wakashu was giri, a feeling of obligation. A wakashu's giri held the relationship together. A ninja rewarded his wakashu for his loyalty by seeing to his education. And a samurai's practice of wakashudo wasn't really supposed to last forever. First, a future samurai would be loved by an older mentor. Once that future samurai was an adult man himself, he would take a younger lover under his wing in turn. And then finally, he would take a wife and, hypothetically, make love to his wife or wives or consorts and spawn children to be future samurai. It's worth noting that writers were lamenting that people had forgotten how to practice the way of youth properly as early as 1482, about the time people were beginning to even come up with a label for the practice of wakashudo. As with many features of samurai life, it was as celebrated for the way it was disappearing as it was for the way it currently existed at any given moment. Wakashudo was always as much of a high-minded ideal than a way the majority of samurai were able to live. Not that they weren't practicing male-male sexuality, but that the ideal of how it passed on beautiful virtues didn't always happen. Now, there are a lot of fun, gossipy stories about shoguns and their lovers from medieval Japan. For example, Ashikaga Yoshimochi eventually had to order his lover to commit seppuku. Ashikaga Yoshimochi's younger brother and successor, Ashikaga Yoshinori, quote, wished to live only for his homosexual love and finally died of it, after receiving homosexual favor, the like of which will not anywhere be found. According to Watanabe, the 10-year-long Onin War, which lasted from 1467 to 1477, seems to have been caused in part by a homosexual affair. But I suppose this kind of historical gossip is probably outside of our scope today. Just as the most famous stories of Chigo love weren't written when Chigo was most popularly practiced, the most famous stories of Wakashudo weren't written in medieval Japan. They come from the pen of the great Edo period writer Ihara Saikaku, who lived from 1642 to 1693. Read Japanese Literature spent a good bit of time on Saikaku in our Season 1 episode, High and Low Literature in Edo, Japan. Saikaku didn't just write about samurai lovers, so we'll come back to him as a great chronicler of male-male love in just a minute. Eventually, more or less all male-male sexual practices in Japan, both Chigo and Wakashu, came to be known as Shudo, and it began to spread from society's elites to society at large. Or at least the public side began to spread. Again, it's highly unlikely that men had to be taught to have sex with other men. By the time Jesuit Catholic missionaries arrived in Japan in the middle of the 16th century, male-male sexuality was widespread and open enough that the European priests were really discombobulated by it. Francis Xavier, who was regarded as a saint by the Roman Catholic Church, wrote, quote, "There are monks who love the sin abhorred by nature," by which he means anal sex. "They admit it themselves. They never deny it. Nobody, neither man nor woman, young nor old, regards this sin as abnormal or abominable." The missionaries were even more scandalized when some of the monks laughed at Francis Xavier when he told them what they were doing was wrong. The missionaries didn't have any better luck with Japan's political leaders. Male-male sexuality was, after all, just as prevalent among samurai. Oichi Yoshitaka, the daimyo, or feudal lord of Suo province in southern Honshu, asked the missionaries to teach him about Christianity. The missionaries thought he was happy to listen to him, and he may well have been, until they, quote, arrived at the sin of Sodom. Yoshitaka was so offended he threw them out. One of the missionaries was convinced Yoshitaka was going to order their executions. During the Edo period, neither the monastery nor the castle remained the center of male-male sexuality. The center became instead Japan's urban entertainment districts. There are several reasons this happened, but one is a relatively amusing failure of government policy. The first kabuki stage actors were women. But kabuki was too erotic with women on stage, right? And it was all too likely women actresses would become prostitutes. So in 1629, the government banned onna kabuki, or women's kabuki. When theaters reopened, wakashu replaced the women on stage. And suddenly, the beautiful youth, who had once been the province of monks and samurai, were within the reach of the middle class. So many men spent their entire fortunes on wakashu kabuki actors that the government also banned wakashu kabuki in 1652. The next time the theater reopened, no one with the characteristic hairstyle of a wakashu was allowed to perform. Hairstyle was a great marker of coming of age in Edo period Japan. An Edo period Japanese man shaved almost the entire crown of his head when he came of age, so a wakashu was a man with forelocks. Once again, thwarting the government's goals, the actors playing roles that once would have been played by wakashu started wearing violet scarves to cover the crowns of their heads, where an adult would be shaved. Now, even fully adult men could act the part of a woman on stage and remain an appropriate object of male-male desire. And so, this, in part, is how kabuki came to be the center of urban merchant class male-male sexuality. As we already discussed, the samurai practice of male-male sexuality was intended to teach younger men to be virtuous. It was considered extremely masculine. Kabuki male-male sexuality was different. The object of desire wasn't an aristocratic warrior in training, but an actor cum prostitute. There was a certain femininity in a wakashu, but more of a developmental femininity. Youth are naturally smaller and less hairy, for example. And the practice of wakashudo puts them in a submissive role traditionally associated with women. But these actors cum prostitutes were usually expected to perform a more feminine gender presentation, sometimes even, in today's language, a more feminine gender. This group included onagata, actors who played female roles, sometimes staying in character both on and off stage, as well as kagema, cross-dressing male prostitutes who served both male and female clients. During the Edo period, nanshoku was one of the most popular subjects for printed material. Nanshoku literally translates as male colors. In practice, it means something more like male-male sexuality or male-male love. It was one of the most common words to indicate one man's sexual desire for another for centuries. Iharo Saikaku was probably the greatest writer of nanshoku stories of the Edo period. He lived from 1642 to 1693, and he was roughly contemporary with the English Civil War, the Dutch colonization of South Africa, and King Philip's War between Native Americans and colonists in the northeast of what is now the United States. I've seen Saikaku described as a gay man, and he may well have slept with other men. However, he was also devoted to his wife, who died when he was 34. As a memorial, he spent 12 hours writing a 1,000-verse poetic requiem. That's about one verse every 40 seconds. The Life of a Sensuous Man, published in 1682, is one of Saikaku's most enduring works. Unfortunately, English language translation has not been as kind as it might be to Saikaku's most scandalous stories. The Life of a Sensuous Man is about Yonosuke, literally man of the world, the son of a well-to-do Osaka merchant and a high-ranking courtesan. A precocious youth, he begins to lust after the women in his life when he is only 7 years old. By the time he is 54, Yonosuke has slept with 3,742 women and 725 men. Saikaku's most famous book about male-male love specifically is called Nanshoku o Kagami, published in 1687 and translated by Paul Gordon Shallow as The Great Mirror of Male Love. It contains 20 chapters of stories about relationships between men, 20 chapters about samurai wakashudo and monk chigo relationships, and then 20 chapters about male-male relationships featuring kabuki actors. So kind of 20 stories about male-male love that's supposed to make the partners better, and 20 stories about male-male relationships that are just supposed to be for pleasure. Taken as a body, Saikaku's work tells us all kinds of things about male-male sexuality during the time he was writing. Although, of course, we have to read with a grain of salt since he is an author of fiction. In 5 Women Who Loved Love, we see a samurai man, now fully an adult, finally turning to women. Gangobe is 26 years old and has never had sex with a woman. Eventually, a woman falls in love with him, cuts her hair, dresses up as a man, and successfully seduces him. Afterward, he confesses, quote, "Between the pleasure one has in a man and that which one obtains with women, there's no difference." And then he marries her. In Saikaku's stories, and probably also in real life, we see that youth was more of a mindset than a reality. While the hierarchy between an older and a younger lover was extremely important, it was often possible to role play out of the way or to think about youth in creative ways. For example, in the tale Two Old Cherry Trees Still in Bloom from the Great Mirror of Male Love, a 66-year-old samurai is still sleeping with his 63-year-old companion, but his companion still wears a wakashu hairstyle. Not long after Saikaku published The Life of a Sensuous Man, the Edo government instituted new censorship policies that made the publication of another book like The Life of a Sensuous Man difficult. So Saikaku turned to content less likely to corrupt public morals. Specifically, he wrote an anthology called Bukegiri Monogatari, something like Tales of Samurai Honor. This one has been translated into English, sort of, as Comrade Loves of the Samurai, previously published as Gay Tales of the Samurai. I'm sorry to report that the English version seems to be a partial translation of a French edition and an extremely old English translation at that. I'd be happy to be corrected or directed to a different translation. You might think that these new censorship-aware stories would involve less sex, but you would be wrong. And that tells us two things. One, the male-male sexuality contained in these stories was not considered the kind of content likely to corrupt public morals. And that two, the relationships depicted in these stories were actually appropriate for a volume that was claiming to teach samurai virtues. Of course, Saikaku wasn't the only author to write about male-male love during the Edo period. There are many other stories involving male-male sexuality. In fact, Junichi Iwata, that Japanese scholar of homosexuality, cataloged 566 of them. But I want to return to another writer, Read Japanese Literature, covered in Season 1, Ueda Akinari, from the episode Kaidan, Japan's Ghost Stories. Ueda Akinari was born in 1734, roughly contemporary with Austrian composer Joseph Haydn, Russian Empress Catherine the Great, King Taskin the Great, who helped unify Siam, now Thailand, and U.S. President George Washington. Today, Akinari's most enduring work is Tales of Moonlight and Rain, published when Akinari was in his early 40s. It's a collection of 9 stories drawn from Chinese and Japanese sources that Akinari adapts to his own purposes and retells in creative ways. In our episode about Akinari, we discussed the story The Chrysanthemum Vow. In the late 1460s, the Warring States period opened with the Onin Wars, which we discussed a little earlier. Local leaders challenged distant warlords for control of the countryside. A Confucian scholar named Hasebe Samon lives just west of Kyoto with his elderly mother, and one day he visits a friend at a nearby inn. He's surprised to hear moaning from the next room. His friend explains that he has found a traveler who was lost and feverish and has given this traveler a room. Over his friend's objections, Samon nurses the stranger back to health as though he were his own brother. When the stranger recovers, he introduces himself as Akana Soemon, a samurai caught up in the recent political chaos. The two men discover that, quote, their thoughts and feelings were in harmony on every subject, and that they are, quote, filled with mutual admiration and joy. Soemon becomes like an elder brother to Samon. And those direct quotes come from Anthony Chambers' translation. When I introduced the Chrysanthemum Vow in that earlier episode, I did mention that there is an implied story here about male-male love. The chrysanthemum blossom was a common symbol of anal intercourse because the blossom, supposedly, resembles an anus. A chrysanthemum vow is a euphemism for a sexual encounter between two men. And in these kinds of Edo period stories, to say two men become like brothers is often a way to say that they have entered an ongoing romantic and/or sexual relationship. If Soemon, the samurai and former invalid, has become like an elder brother, he is the partner who would be expected to penetrate when the two had sex, and who would have special obligations to care for the future of Samon, the Confucian scholar. Eventually, Soemon has to leave, but he promises to return before the end of autumn on the day of the Chrysanthemum Festival. Again, we've got chrysanthemums. Samon counts the days and prepares for his friend's return, but the Chrysanthemum Festival arrives with no sign of Soemon. Just as Samon's going to give up and he's getting ready to retire for the night, he sees his friend by the light of the Milky Way. Soemon quietly refuses Samon's hospitality and explains, "I am not a man of this world. A filthy ghost has taken this form to briefly appear before you." He had been imprisoned all summer and wasn't going to be able to escape and keep his promise. Finally, desperate to see his friend, he fell on his sword and traveled on the wind to bid Samon farewell. The next day, Samon begins a journey to Soemon's home to bury Soemon's body. When he arrives, he lectures Soemon's samurai captor. A samurai does not concern himself with the vicissitudes of rank and fortune. He values only loyalty. Finally, he kills Soemon's captor and escapes. Truly, the story ends. One must not form bonds with a shallow man. Tales of Moonlight and Rain includes at least one other tale about male-male love. It's called The Blue Cowl, and it's about a Zen Buddhist priest and his chigo. I have to warn you, it's pretty creepy and a little gross. As they so often did when we tell any story from Japanese history, things changed with the coming of the Meiji Restoration. As you may recall, on July 8, 1853, U.S. Commodore Meiji Period sailed 4 black ships into Tokyo Harbor. The end result was that the Tokugawa government was more or less forced to sign the unequal treaties. There are many reasons for the collapse of the Tokugawa shogunate that had ruled Japan since 1603, but the opening of Japan's ports was more or less the final nail in the coffin. The last shogun, Yoshinobu Tokugawa, effectively lost power at the end of 1867. On July 3, 1868, a number of samurai deposed Tokugawa and proclaimed that the young Emperor Meiji was the ruler of Japan. You may also recall that the emperor hadn't held any real power in Japan for more than 1,000 years. And he didn't hold real power after the Meiji Restoration. The Restoration really just changed who was pulling the strings. The Meiji period of Japanese history lasts from 1868 until the emperor's death in 1912. And probably the greatest cultural change of Meiji Japan was a move to adopt and adapt from modern civilizations. In this context, Europe and the United States. The Bunmei Kaika movement pushed forward technologies imported from Europe and the US, technologies like railroads and telegraph lines. The movement also encouraged European and American intellectual trends and even dress. Bunmei Kaika translates as civilization and enlightenment. It was not, and this is important, was not the reintroduction of Christianity to Japan that caused a change in Japanese attitudes about male-male love. Instead, 2 other factors really drove the change. One was the growing emphasis on the family as the primary unit for the organization of society. Ideally, folks of childbearing age should only be having sex if it might result in a baby, according to the Meiji government. More importantly, European ideas about medicine, particularly when it came to sexuality, quickly changed the way Japan thought about sexuality. The work of German-Austrian doctor Richard von Krafft-Ebing was particularly important, especially after his book Psychopathia Sexualis was translated into Japanese in 1894. While Krafft-Ebing's work is long outdated today, It was actually something of a step forward, maybe, for people engaging in sexual activity with members of their own sex in Europe and the US. The viewpoint still seems dated and offensive today, but Krafft-Ebing was one of the first doctors who was taken seriously when he proposed that homosexuality wasn't a result of immorality, seduction, or bad genes. It was just an innate neuropsychopathic disorder. Gay and lesbian activists worldwide worked long and hard to get rid of that particular bit of bad science, but that's another story for another day. While taking homosexuality from a sin to a mere disorder might have been something of a step forward in Europe, or maybe 2 steps forward and 1 step backward, it was absolutely not positive progress in Japan. Not only did Krafft-Ebing's work pathologize same-sex love for the first time in Japanese history, it remained the primary influence on Japanese attitudes about male-male sexuality until after World War II. The work of Meiji-era Japanese doctors and sexologists made Krafft-Ebing's work into an even more important part of Japanese intellectual life. Those doctors include Ogai Mori, who was not only a doctor, actually, he was the Surgeon General of the Japanese Army, but also one of Japan's most important 19th and early 20th century novelists. We'll come back to him and his work in just a minute. These sexologists' work also resulted in the creation of a new Japanese term, dosei, which is probably the closest available translation, linguistically speaking, for the English homosexuality. Dosei uses the kanji for same, followed by the kanji for sex or gender. It can also be combined with the character I, meaning love, to form dosei-ai, or same-sex love. It was the first Japanese term that implied male-male sexuality, has a relationship to female-female sexuality. It's also of limited use because it doesn't typically show up as a word people use to describe themselves. Not when it was more common, and certainly not today. A brief side note that the Meiji period is the only period during which male-male love was even briefly illegal during Japanese history. Anal intercourse was banned from 1873 to 1882, although that law does not seem to have been widely enforced. So what was the effect of these new attitudes on Japanese culture? What was the effect of the idea male-male sexuality was outdated or pathological? Remember when we discussed nanshoku earlier in the episode? It literally translates as male colors, and it means male-male desire. Evocations of nanshoku became a symbol of an old Japan that was quickly slipping away. The continuing traditions of nanshoku became an especially important symbol for the samurai, or men who had once been samurai and their sons. It wasn't long into the Meiji period before there were no more samurai. The Meiji government abolished the samurai class through a series of edicts, the Haitore, passed between 1870 and 1876. The last great stand against the end of the samurai class was the Satsuma Rebellion in 1877, depicted quite badly in the 2003 American film The Last Samurai. Everyone knows The Last Samurai would have needed Tom Cruise to help them fight. The former samurai of Satsuma Domain lost, and the samurai class ceased to exist. Nevertheless, the former samurai of Satsuma had retained a reputation for being especially martial for centuries, and continued to do so for at least another generation. In the context of Japan, that meant they were particularly associated with nanshoku. When the men of Satsuma began to arrive in Tokyo to serve in government or to study at Japan's new European-style universities, they brought with them copies of an obscure late Edo period text that had very recently become all the rage in Satsuma, Shizu no Odamaki, or Thread from the Spool. I provided a link to Danielle Durante's translation in the journal Japanese Language and Literature on the episode page. You can read it for free. Creative Commons licenses are amazing, and thank you to every scholar and journal who shares their work. The thread from the spool is based on the story of a young Sangoro Hirata and his mentor and lover Kyoye Daizo Yoshida. The real historical men died together fighting in the Shonai Rebellion of 1599. And there's no evidence the two had a romantic or sexual bond. The thread from the spool was probably written around the time Commodore Perry sailed into Tokyo Harbor in 1853. The text adds a lot to the original story, building a narrative that celebrates non-shoku as something virtuous, romantic, and erotic. For example, Kyoye could not control his passion any longer. Like the willow branch that gets lifted by a gust of wind, he embraced Sangoro from behind and blew out the lamp. Darkness enveloped them. A fragrance of plum blossoms exuded from Sangoro's sleeves. Their sentiments intertwined like yarn, and now the unraveling of the knot bared their skin as white as snow, which they could finally touch. They swore the brotherhood oath. The bliss Kyoye felt was beyond compare. The narrative style also makes it clear that the love between Kyoye and Sangoro makes them better samurai. Immediately after this evocative love scene, the joys of their relationship help them devote themselves to, quote, the ways of the letters and the martial arts. By reading and sharing the thread from the spool, men had a way to celebrate and stand up for the hyper-masculine non-shoku traditions that were important to the ways they thought about themselves. Such men managed to get the story reprinted in a popular periodical and then in several standalone editions. Ultimately, the thread from the spool didn't turn back time on the cultural movement away from non-shoku, but it does show how important the practice of non-shoku remained to a lot of people. And it suggests how important the thread of hypermasculine male-male sexuality will remain in Japan. We'll come back to that in part 2. How else did Meiji cultural developments affect Japanese literature? Over the course of the Meiji period, censorship of works evoking male-male sexuality was more likely to occur in Japan than it ever had been before. Edo period officials did sometimes practice censorship. Remember, we mentioned the way their attitudes shaped what Saikaku wrote. They just didn't particularly act as though male-male sexuality were something that needed to be censored. Between censorship and changing tastes, stories about male-male love fell quickly out of favor. You may remember from earlier this episode that Junichi Iwata cataloged 566 works of non-shoku literature during the Edo period. During the Meiji period, he cataloged just 67. Most of these were medical studies, exposés, and scholarly commentaries on Edo history, rather than literature. The newly pathologized version of homosexuality and all the vocabulary that goes with it pops up in Meiji period literature, too. Sometimes it's a new way to talk about male-male sexuality that could often, but not always, escape the censors. Mori Ogai's novel Vita Sexualis is a famous example of a novel that addresses male-male sexuality using this new vocabulary. The novel is presented as the thoughts of an older narrator named Shizuka Kanai as he reflects on his development as a sexual being from the ages of 6 to 21, especially during middle and high school. Many critics read Vita Sexualis as partially autobiographical. Ultimately, the novel was banned a month after its publication in 1909, and Mori was reprimanded by Japan's Vice Minister of War. Remember, Mori was not only a novelist, he was also a doctor, Surgeon General of Japan's armed forces. So sometimes he uses the most modern of sexological terms. He introduces the idea of nanshoku, which he first encountered at school when he was 11, but later he uses the term earning, pulled directly from Krafft-Ebing's work. An earning, Uranian in English, is a term that's almost always considered outdated today. It describes a man who loves other men and who is essentially feminine in nature, as opposed to a dioning, who is essentially masculine in nature, under Krafft-Ebing's description. Notably, Mori uses earning specifically to say that an older student who approached Kanei was barking up the wrong tree. Remember, Kanei is the Mori stand-in here. Kanei, quote, can't stand it because he didn't have the markings of an earning. Vita Sexualis also backs up the perception that practitioners of nanshoku are particularly masculine. Mori describes two groups living in his dorm, the nanpa and the koha. The nanpa were dandies who affected elegance of dress and manner. The nanpa were notorious womanizers. The narrator also complains that they aren't very hard-working students. They spend time looking at pictures of naked women, and they sleep with women at the bathhouse. The koha were more manly and casual in their dress. Instead of pornographic prints, the koha read the thread from the spool. And they are the ones interested in male-male sexuality. Think about how different this is than the way homosexuals were perceived in contemporary Europe or America. Compare the koha to, say, the Anglo-Irish Oscar Wilde, who was sentenced to 2 years hard labor for gross indecency with other males in 1895. I'd like to mention that the same year Vita Sexualis was published also saw the publication of the first known story published by a Korean author writing Japanese in Japan. It's a nanshoku story called Is This Love by Yi Kwangzu. You can read the story in Janet Poole's translation in Queer Subjects in Modern Japanese Literature. But overall, by the end of the Meiji period, very little nanshoku or dosei appeared in Japanese literature, especially in comparison to the rest of Japan's 1,000-plus year history. That's all for today. I hope you can join us for part 2 when we take up our story again in the Taisho period and women finally enter the stage. We haven't focused on one single text today, but you can look at the episode page for all the works we've talked about so far and all the works we're going to discuss. There's also a comprehensive bibliography of the scholarship I've been able to make use of for this episode. Thank you to my Patreon supporters for making my university library membership possible and paying for the purchase of secondary sources. In case you haven't guessed so far, this episode was very research heavy. You can join the Patreon supporters for as little as $3 a month by visiting patreon.com/readjapaneseliterature. A note, please don't join Read Japanese Literature or any new Patreons through the iPhone app. The App Store is implementing a ridiculous surcharge, so the organizations you want to support won't be getting most of your donation. Again, just visit patreon.com/readjapaneseliterature. A special thanks to our new Patreon supporters, including Kenji Lane and Pat B. We'd love to hear from you about the podcast. There are so many ways to stay in touch. We're now on Facebook. As always, you can contact us through the website or Patreon. We're on YouTube /@readjapaneseliterature, Blue Sky @readjapaneselit.bsky.social, Instagram also @readjapaneselit. As always, thank you to producer Kaim for today's music, kaimmusic.com.